All right, here we go. Here's our last stretch of the rise of the Allied subnodes. So let me share my screen. Here we go. General Douglas MacArthur is the next person for us to talk about. He was the supreme commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific, so he is the one who's kind of responsible on orchestrating, the attack and response strategy in terms of island hopping and things like that to take down Japan. Uh, he was forced to flee U.S. basing in the Philippines after Japan attacked U.S. forces there, and then eventually used this notion of island hopping to get back to the Philippines by jumping from island to island to island to island to island, and made it difficult for the Japanese to kind of follow them, right? That it led to a game of maritime chase. And he was the one who received and signed Japan's official documentation of surrender in September of 1945. So, this is attributed to MacArthur, the soldier above all others praised for peace, and for it is the soldier who must suffer and bear the deepest of wounds and scars of war, right? So, again, we're seeing another one of these prominent individuals kind of talk about uh, why war is something that should be avoided, right? That soldiers are the ones who will physically, mentally, emotionally have the most to lose from being involved. We pivot from the US next to the UK. We talked about the fall of Neville Chamberlain at the end of the appeasement notes, and the rise of Winston Churchill, who did not agree with the strategy of appeasement at all. So he was a huge uh, whistleblower is not the right word, but he was kind of perceived as the person who was warning about the dangers of Nazi Germany prior to World War II, and ultimately, right, he gets to have his cake and eat it too in terms of being right and navigate the UK through the conflict against Germany in World War II. We talked about his ascent to the prime ministership after Neville Chamberlain resigned and refused any kind of armistice or peace with Nazi Germany. Right, the Nazis were something that needed to be squashed, and he used the power of the radio massively throughout World War II. That his broadcasts were kind of seen as this big symbol of hope throughout World War II that kind of inspired the British people who were dealing with the massive threat of Germany, just a quick ocean's hop across from them. And again, here's a clip of one of Winston Churchill's speeches if you want to look at it and determine if he was passionate and inspiring. One of the notable military leaders from the United Kingdom is Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. He was the commander of the British Eighth Army, who led forces through North Africa in some of the same territories that we talked about. The American generals kind of working through. And helped secure an important victory at El Alamein, which we will talk about in the next set of lecture notes next activity as we kind of fly through some of the major battles. He led the Allied invasions of Sicily and Italy, right? So he is kind of the dagger to taking down the threat of Mussolini. And, he was the commander of the Allied ground forces during D-Day, which we'll talk about again. So here's an image of him kind of discussing battle plans with troops in the field, right? A bunch of these lovely honor shots. There's Eisenhower in the image next to him. And the next figure that I want to talk about is Charles de Gaulle. And there's one major element that we haven't talked about yet that we'll get to in the battles activity. But if you're not aware, France surrenders to Germany in World War II and becomes a Nazi occupied territory. And there's a resistance movement during World War II within France known as Free France, and that's where Charles de Gaulle kind of becomes uh, a continued notable leader. So he was the commander of the French armored division in their battles against Nazi Germany, and when the Nazis were ultimately, uh, you know, taking France down, and the French government was willing to surrender, he refused to accept it and led the government of what was called Free France in exile. And he commanded the resistance, the French resistance forces, who are not the puppet state or the puppet controlled elements of the French military that were controlled by Germany. And he, in exile from England or North Africa, becomes responsible for kind of creating the tactics to help liberate France. And what you see here is a letter that he writes to kind of inspire the French citizens who were living in the occupied French territory. And I'll let you read this letter on U-Time. That's longer than a quote about war for me to read. But I'll post this, excuse me, in its entirety on Classroom. But you can kind of see it's the same kind of rallying cry that we saw in some Dr. Seuss campaign or propaganda campaigns, right? It's this, excuse me, rallying cry to French citizens. Do not give up hope because you are occupied or because we surrendered, right? This is not who France is. We are free individuals. We will fight for our freedom. We will crush the enemy. You need to do whatever you can, sacrifice whatever you can to restore France to her former glory. So here's a picture again of the same cluster of leaders that we've been talking about. Here's a walk through Paris, right, with the Arc de Triomphe in the background after the liberation of France. So we've talked about a bunch of different personalities throughout the two parts of these sets of notes. So what I want you to have an answer to by the time we get to our period of office hours, or at least be willing to discuss during office hours after this lecture, is based on the personalities and characteristics, the tactics, the quotations, the whatever, from all of these different leaders from England, France, or the United Kingdom, France, and the United States of America. Who would you be most willing to serve for, work with, learn from, and why, right? Be able to justify that response, and we'll see, right, that I think this discussion becomes as interesting to me as listening to you all or reading you all's DBQs about whether or not Germany should be seen as being responsible for the sole causes of World War One. So like I said, the next two big clusters of World War II that we have to knock out will do just a rush through some of the major battles. I think you all know that I'm not a big, like, war is the end all be all kind of history people, that we did some of those dip-ins on World War One. We'll do some of those dip-ins on World War Two. And then we'll talk about kind of the events that led to the Holocaust and then create some allusions between the Holocaust and the modern world. And that's how we'll wrap up World War II before we move on to the Cold War era of history. So hopefully I'm going to go get some sleep now, which is probably a lie. Probably going to go play Animal Crossing. I think I owe $198,000 or bells on my house expansion loan. And I need to be a good, responsible weed pooler, fisherman, fruit gatherer, and pay my bills. Also, hopefully the next time you see me, I won't be in the same green shirt. And if I am, you'll know that I haven't showered for like 6 days. And this is going to be a gross shirt. And for that, you can't smell me. You can't judge me. You can judge me. I don't care. I'll fight you. Have a good one. Good night.